For 36 years now, every month of October, Cubans recall one of the most horrifying terrorist acts against their territory, the sabotage of a Cuban passenger airliner in Barbados. The Cubans who died that day form part of the more than 3,400 fatal victims caused by acts of terror against Cuba, which have also left more than 2,000 disabled. And despite being a victim for more than 50 years, Cuba was included in the list of state sponsors of terrorism unilaterally elaborated by the United States, a pretext to maintain the economic, commercial, and financial blockade, affirms this Foreign Ministry's official.
That U.S. list is not only unsustainable, but also, in our view, it affects the credibility of the supposed interest that government has to confront terrorism. It affects the credibility because it is a list that is totally contrary to the resolutions of the General Assembly on the question of terrorism, and indeed the very resolutions of the Security Council. It is totally contrary to international law, to a global strategy against terrorism adopted by the UN General Assembly.
The policy of genocide against Cuba has been condemned at the UN General Assembly. The damage caused to different sectors has been made known for 20 years.
Cuba has supported all the resolutions that have been adopted at the United Nations on terrorism, including some approved by the Security Council, such as resolutions 1540, 1267, or 1373, with some of which we have had some reservations about the way they were negotiated and the limitations in their execution. But despite this, Cuba has strongly supported them.
Cuba has always condemned terrorism publicly. It has demonstrated its firm stance inside the country and abroad. Today, 5 Cubans are in prison in the United States precisely for fighting terrorism. Dami Vale and Graciela Requejo, Prensa Latina Television.
For the last 12 years, the U.S. has been embroiled with a global war on terror, launching preemptive invasions of countries, full-on drone assassination campaigns, and here at home, ramping up the police and surveillance state to seemingly no end. Much of the news is focused on countries in the Middle East. And it's no surprise when you consider that the government's perennial blacklist includes countries like Iran, Sudan, and Syria. But there's also one Latin American country on the same list, one that's been on the government's blacklist for decades: Cuba. Oddly enough, although the U.S. labels Cuba as state sponsors of terrorism, little do we realize that for the last 40 years, Cuba has been subject to probably more international terrorism than most countries around the world. And it all started from the direct outset of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. When the U.S. government began to discuss its intention to overthrow the new government of Cuba by any means necessary. Aside from the crippling embargo, the U.S. has been employing a multitude of other tactics in an attempt to crush the socialist revolution. Things like Operation Mongoose and the bombing of Cuban airliners and boats and embassies. But while all of this was going on, there were also Cuban opposition groups committing terrorist acts in and outside of Cuba, many of which were based in Miami, Florida. Most notably, Commandos F4, Brothers to the Rescue, and Cuban American National Foundation, which were all supported by the FBI and CIA, and whose activities caused thousands of Cuban deaths. Now, like any country looking to prevent terrorism on its own soil, Castro sent 5 men to Miami in 1990 to infiltrate these groups in order to thwart future terrorist attacks against Cuba. Those men are Antonio Guerrero, Fernando Gonzalez, Rene Gonzalez, Gerardo Hernandez, and Ramon Labinieno, who are infamously known as the Cuban Five. Because you see, in 1998, the FBI arrested all 5 men who some would call anti-terrorists, and charged them with committing espionage conspiracy against the U.S. And for the next 17 months, the Cuban Five were held in solitary confinement before their 7-month trial commenced. In 2001, they were sentenced to 4 life terms and 75 years in federal prison. But the fight for their justice has been an ongoing struggle. In fact, in 2005, there was an appeal and the reversal of that appeal, eventually ending with one of the members being released, albeit stuck in the U.S. on probation for 3 years. But the fight is far from over to release these political prisoners. However, the glaring point missed in this is that these men were never here to commit espionage or conspire against the United States government. Their objective was simply to protect their homeland, the same way the U.S. claims it does in so many countries around the world every day. But perhaps even worse is the more obvious truth, which is that this government doesn't care about preventing terrorism. If it did, then it wouldn't be supporting groups like these Cuban groups that I just mentioned. What American foreign policy is really about is making sure that the last independent states are undermined and eventually destroyed. The Cuban Five are a symbol of that truth, which is why they should never be forgotten.